Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to this week's coronavirus edition of Global Environmental Health. This week, we're covering food systems. So, food is obviously a critically important aspect of health and well being for humans, but how we grow the food and how we sustain a growing human population is a really important part of understanding environmental health because, obviously, in addition to having important implications for human health, how we grow our food and how we sustain this growing human population has important consequences for the health of the environment as well. And as we've learned so far in class, the health of the environment and the health of human populations are critically linked together. So, when we talk about food, we have to have a discussion about the food system. So, that bagel that you get at your coffee shop in the morning or that salad you eat for lunch, um, depending on what it is, it's probably had a pretty interesting journey to get to your plate. And when you talk about food from its kind of source, from the farm all the way to your plate, this whole process of getting the food to you is called the food system. And in the United States, the food system for producing food accounts for 50% of the land that we use. So, of land that's being used, half of it is being used for food. 16% of energy use and 80% of the water we use is goes into the food system, is to grow food. So the food system travels through the landscape or through the environment via a complex supply chain. So we talked a little bit about this when we did our collaboration exercise with the occupational therapy department, looking at the journey of food from locally sourced farms to the Calorega Dining Hall. Um, but the food system and the elements of the food system are what we're going to kind of focus on today and in this week's module. So, simply put, the food system consists of food production. So, how do we kind of grow food? Think of agricultural farms, pastures for animals, etc. Once the food is grown or produced, how do we distribute it, either locally or across the country or globally? And then, how is food consumed? And then, what do we do with that food that is not consumed? So, waste disposal. And each of these elements are obviously pretty complicated in that they're interrelated and they have, again, a profound impact on both human health and the health of ecosystems in the environment. So the food system can basically also be broken down into two main categories. So you have inputs, the things that you have to like put into this food system, this chain, and think of this as like an interconnected kind of circular chain. You need to, feed the food system, I guess pun intended there, with things like fertilizers. Fertilizers help boost crop yields. This is really the nutrients that a lot of crops need to grow. Pesticides to keep bugs away, and things like that. Energy to run tractors and farm equipment and all the other things that you need to actually produce food. Water obviously is an important aspect of this, and then the occupation of food production, so the labor involved at each step along the way. And when we talked about this exercise with the occupational therapy folks, a lot of our projects and discussions were looking at the distribution network and how food is transported from point A to point B. Then you also have the outputs. Outputs can be both positive and negative. So obviously, food that is produced as a result of the food system is a positive output, and really, the whole MO or the whole goal of the food system is to produce food, obviously. But some other outputs can be negative. Contamination, for example. This may consist of agricultural fertilizer runoff, um, pesticides, etc., the greenhouse gases that are produced in terms of the distribution angle. So trucks, transporting food across the country can produce greenhouse gases, CO2 emissions. Cows and other animals produce a lot of methane, and methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. And then we have other kind of waste elements along the way. So packaging, food packaging, and even food that spoils or is not eaten. Um, so we can break down and we can think of the food system as this chain that has both inputs to keep it running and outputs that are the results of the food system. So the first stage in the food production or food production chain is food production. Um, so this is basically the starting point, right? And in the United States and a lot of parts of the world, we've shifted to this industrial agriculture model. So producing food at a large scale, cranking out eggs, um, beef production, the vast cornfields that you see if you drive through like parts of the Midwest. If you've driven through the Central Valley in California, you see basically the entire central part of the state is industrial agriculture, these really big farms. And this has the greatest impact on environmental health. This element of the food system chain has the biggest thumbprint in terms of environmental health. And the industrial agriculture food production element includes things like crop production. So that's growing things like corn and apples and almonds and salad. Can I get a kale? And animals. Food animals is another one. Um, we can also talk about seafood as well as part of this. So either farmed or wild caught seafood. So this is food production in kind of a nutshell. I guess there's another food pun for you. So, like I said, most food that we eat, most food that we buy at the store is produced using industrial methods. And industrial agriculture is, again, just large scale um, production of food to feed a growing population as efficiently as cheaply as possible. And some important inputs that we need to talk about and recognize when we're talking about environmental health is the inputs of fuels. So the energy to kind of keep this running. A lot of them involve fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are those things that produce greenhouse gases. So when we burn gasoline, for example, that is considered a fossil fuel that results in carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. Other inputs include pesticides. So when you have large fields of crops, um, typically you don't see like a mixture of crops. You see, a huge field of corn or like a huge, you know, uh, field of strawberries, or it's all like one thing, right? You usually don't see like a whole like forest of food, right? And this model is called a monoculture. So mono meaning one, culture meaning culture. Um, and it's basically a pretty standard way of growing food in the industrial agriculture model. And one of the benefits of this is it's efficient, but one of the drawbacks is when you have uh, just one type of crop, it's really susceptible to like pests and invasive insects and the diseases that they carry. So if you have a giant cornfield and you have um, maybe an insect that invades that can spread a disease that uh, wipes out corn crops, because there's nothing else, there's really nothing to stop it. So it can be susceptible to pests in this way. So pesticides are a big part of the industrial agriculture chain. So keeping pests, biological invasions down, so that we can grow and sustain and continue these monoculture farm operations. Chemical fertilizers. So when you grow food, it's the plants need nutrients from the soil, and when you're growing food and crops on a large scale, you're depleting a lot of the nutrients out of the soil, that is going into to the crops, and you can wait for years for nature to kind of naturally replenish the nutrients, or since we don't have that kind of time and that's not cost effective, we add chemical fertilizers to replace the natural nutrient content of the soil so that we can continue to grow crops at a large scale. um, and we do that with chemical synthetic fertilizers. um, and then we need large scale machinery of various sorts to kind of make all this run. So the goal of industrial agriculture is here: the greatest yield. The greatest yield at the lowest cost. So getting the most, squeezing the most crops, the most fruits, the most vegetables, whatever, out of a plot of land at the lowest cost possible. That is the goal of industrial agriculture. So this is obviously happening at a large scale and requires natural resources to keep all this running. Soil is obviously fundamental to growing crops, water to make it all happen. Um, Biodiversity. So, where does biodiversity come into this? We just talked a little bit about monocultures. So, these big plots of just like corn or strawberries or whatever. Um, that's the opposite of biodiversity. There's this big debate about whether we need to shift to more like kind of biodiverse, crop models, but we'll talk about that later. But biodiversity can also include like insects. So not only like harmful insects that are pests and cause disease in plants, but also the natural critical insects like pollinators. Um, we can also talk about the natural function of like birds. Birds are really great at controlling pests. And then you have the organisms that act as decomposers in the soil and things like that. So if you've ever driven down again, like the freeway in Central California, and you drive down the freeway in the spring, you might notice a lot of like bugs hitting your windshield, and that's probably bees. And if you look to the side, you see a lot of like these white boxes, and those are beehives that they put out there during the spring to pollinate the trees that are flowering. So they kind of like are renting pollinators temporarily, and they put them all over the place, and it's kind of this big bee kind of slaughter sometimes. Um, so if you're thinking to yourself, well, geez, that sounds a lot like ecosystem services of specifically like biodiversity, and you would be right. Biodiversity is an ecosystem service, and pollinators, decomposers, the predators that control pests. These are all ecosystem services that the industrial agriculture operation really critically depends on. Like we cannot have the food system that we have without these important ecosystem services. So this production of food, this industrial agriculture model, is very susceptible and shaped by and influenced by environmental factors. So climate change is something we've been talking a lot about because climate change impacts basically every aspect of environmental health, and food production is no exception. Land use as well is a big environmental factor. So this is an interesting map looking at what impact climate change is having on basically crop yield. So crop yield is another way of saying, how much are we getting out of that plot of land? Like, how much corn are we getting out of that 1 acre? Are we getting more or less? We have like the same amount of land. Like the amount of land we have is finite and not going anywhere. Um, how do we get more food out of that same plot of land? And climate change has a really big influence on that. So on this map is essentially where crop yield is either increasing or decreasing as a result of climate change. So areas in yellow, orange, and red are where crop yields are going down because of a changing climate. And you can see in the United States, we're susceptible to this trend. In the United States, our crop yields are going down because of climate change. So that same area of land is not producing as much food as a result of warming temperatures and changing rainfall patterns and et cetera. You can also see that and this is affecting a lot of places in the world, particularly in Africa, where crop yields are really going down in a big way. But what's interesting is you also see a few places where this almost looks beneficial. So Canada is an example of this, of where crop yields might actually be increasing a little bit because maybe they have longer growing seasons now because of warmer temperatures. But in general, if you were to kind of add it all up, I would argue that it's a net negative in terms of crop yield. So note that, again, the impacts of climate change are not evenly distributed. There can be some winners, there can be some losers, but if you add it all up, it's overall a loss for crop yield. So here's the situation we're in. By 2050, the estimates are that we will have an additional 2 to 3 billion more people on the planet bumping elbows with us. Um, that means we're going to need twice as much food that we grow right now. Um, the trend overall is that humans are becoming wealthier on average. Socioeconomic status and incomes are actually, on average, increasing, just like things like life expectancy and overall health and well being are increasing. Of course, this is not universally true. There are great health disparities and wealth gaps that still exist. But on average, this overall income increase is projected or likely to mean more consumption of food. And studies have shown that when people have access to more money or are able to have more food choices, they opt for meat. And in a lot of parts of the world, a thing like a steak is kind of a status thing, and you're shooting for that. So that's sort of the situation we're in. Is we're going to be adding a lot more people to the planet. Population growth continues to go up, and we're going to need to feed all those people. So this is the challenge. How do we adequately feed everyone on the planet? How do we give everyone that's going to be on the planet, those extra 2 to 3 billion people, enough food to sustain health and well-being? How are we going to double food production over the next 20, 30, 40 years? And how do we achieve both of these goals while becoming environmentally and health sustainable? So how do we do this in a way that is going to be sustainable, meaning is not just a short-term solution? How do we grow enough food for all these people in a way that we can continue to do it year after year after year? It's a big challenge. Put another way, how can we feed the planet without destroying it? This is a fundamental question that food system scientists, environmental health scientists, and everyone involved with food systems, nutrition, and food production are grappling with. And this is a really important question that anyone involved in human health, or especially environmental health, should be asking as well, is how can we feed people on the planet without destroying the planet? So we can just grow more food? No, because we're already doing that. Where we can grow food, basically we are. So this is a map of, in green, where we are growing crops, and in orange we are growing we're converted land into pasture for like animals. And you can see that basically the whole planet is covered with the exception of a few places. There's a big exception up here. Whoops. In Siberia and up in the Arctic. There is an exception in the Saharan Desert in Africa. And in South America, this is the Amazon rainforest. And then up in northern Canada is, again, more Arctic kind of snow. So these are areas that really, kind of can't grow food. So the places that can, we are. So the solution is not, well, we just expand the farmland because there's nowhere else to like kind of go, right? And if we wanted to put some math behind this, we can say that 38% of the planet's land surface is being farmed right now. And this is not including Antarctica or Greenland. So by far, agriculture and food production is the biggest use of land on the planet. So what's left, like I just said, is kind of savannas or tropical forests. And given what we know about ecosystem services of forests, the importance of having a thing like the Amazon rainforest, um, it would not be a sustainable option to convert this to farmland. So another interesting kind of point here is that a lot of the food we grow goes to feed basically other food. Um, 35% of the food we actually grow goes to feed animals, which are then used as food down the road. So it's actually a fairly resource intensive process because, for example, it takes 66 pounds of grain to make 2 pounds of beef. So it takes a lot of resources, a lot of inputs to get, beef and other kind of animal um, food production. So I thought I came across this kind of funny article, and I think we've talked about this a little in class. And I miss seeing you all. Hopefully, this will be over soon, right? Um, but there's some solutions that we're kind of kicking around here. Is a lot of people are grappling with this question of, again, how do we feed the planet without destroying it? Um, you know, there's still this big appetite for beef and meat. So given that we know that cows produce methane and greenhouse gases, and that it's takes a lot of grain and crops to feed cows for beef, um, how can we develop some systems or some solutions to this? And one is altering the food that we're giving the cows. So if we feed them this kind of seaweed diet, this could both be nutritious for the cows, feed them, and it could produce cows with less methane. Um, and I like the title here. Feeding seaweed to cows could curb their methane laden burps. And of course, if you're like me, you see an article like that, you're going to click it and read it. And I did. And here it is. So I have this TED Talk up on the website, and I would encourage you to watch it. And I think it does a really good job of framing this kind of problem of, we have a growing human population. How are we going to go about feeding it in a sustainable way? This is a talk by Dr. John Foley, who was actually my old boss when I was working at the University of Minnesota doing my first postdoc. He was the director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota, and he left that position to actually now run the Cal Academy of Sciences. So if you've ever been to the Cal Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, this is the director of that place, which is a really, really cool organization. If you haven't been, you should definitely go. So he's proposed in his talk and in his papers the kind of outline for feeding this growing human population. So he's proposed what he calls solutions for a cultivated planet. One is to stop expanding our agricultural footprint. With the map that I showed you, we're already growing food and using land in a really big way. And one solution to feeding the planet is cannot be expanding or increasing the size of our farms. So, a solution or an important solution to a cultivated planet is to slow and ultimately stop the expansion of agriculture into forests. And there's a really big program called RED, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation. And it's this really big kind of environmental health project or program in which basically countries that are higher socioeconomic status pay countries that have a lot of tropical forest to basically protect their rainforest. So they are paid to preserve the forest instead of selling it to agriculture. And this program is called RED. And there's been a lot of research that's come out recently that suggests that this is working, and this is an approach that's working. Another solution is that we need to close yield gaps. So yield gaps are these basically differences, and with the map I showed, where certain areas are producing higher or lower percentages of food. We need to close these yield gaps. So we need to double food production, basically in the same amount of land. So how do we get more yield or more food out of existing agricultural systems? So a couple ways to do this is to boost productivity of our best farms through genetic modification, better land use management. So when we have really good, efficient farms, how can we make them even better? How can we make them more productive? And the least productive farms that are maybe taking up a lot of space, but they're not like producing as much food as they could. We need to boost the yields of these less productive farms. So if there's a farm that's producing 100 pounds of corn a day or something, how can we double that? And he and his group have done a lot of thinking about this and have pinpointed areas globally where um, crop yields are either kind of low, average, or high. And this gives us a good template for like where in the world we can try to increase crop yields in like underperforming farms, and etc. So you can see that there's quite a lot of work to be done, and basically areas that are not green are where we could improve the crop yield, where we're growing food, but could be growing food a lot better or a lot more efficiently in these areas. So this is a really cool bit of research showing that, well, we don't need to expand our agricultural footprint anymore, because look at all these opportunities to improve food yields. Basically everything that's like brown and yellow here, we could be getting a lot more food out of those areas. And if we're talking about producing twice as much food to feed the growing human population, all of these areas in basically brown and yellow need to go to green. So one way of doing that is to more efficiently use resources. So I like this little quote: "More crop per drop." How do we get more crops? How do we increase our food yield with the same amount of resources? So how do we use the same or less amount of water to increase these crop yields, to move all this yellow and brown to green using the same amount of resources? So how do we get more crop per drop? So part of that comes with, like, how do we actually water our agriculture? How do we actually distribute the water into crop production? And if you've ever, again, driven through the Central Valley, or maybe the Midwest, or any large scale agricultural operations, you see these watering systems that basically just kind of like spray, or they're like sprinklers basically, and they just spray a bunch of water everywhere. And obviously, if you look at that, you're thinking, well, that seems like kind of a waste of water because there's a lot of evaporation. Like, how much of that water is actually going directly to the plant to help it grow? A better approach is with drip irrigation, where you just are putting just enough water that the plant needs, and you're trying to waste as little as possible. Like, this little dirt spot over here doesn't need any water. We need the water right here. So if we just spray the water everywhere, a lot of that just gets wasted. Mulching your garden, you probably heard of, but doing this on a bigger scale basically helps to limit um, evaporation of water. So there's a lot of ways that we can improve the way that we're using water, which is another limited resource. Reducing food waste. So part of the food system is the consumption of food, but then also, what do we do when we don't consume the food? So this is a pretty staggering statistic that disturbs me, is that 30% of all the food that's produced is lost. So how do we feed more people? How do we feed more people on the planet without destroying it? Well, 30% of the food we're already producing is not even being eaten. So if we're looking for ways to efficiently close that gap, reducing food waste is a pretty viable option. Um, and I would encourage you guys, if you're looking for some interesting reading, or some um, quarantine or physical isolation, learning activities or opportunities, look up the Freegan movement. Freegan, like, vegan, but like free. And there's a lot of interesting documentaries about Freegans, and there's, not surprisingly, a pretty healthy, thriving Freegan population in the Bay Area. And these are people that basically try to live 100% off of what would be food waste, so food that's maybe expired or thrown out or whatever. And this guy on the right is a Freegan, so there you go. One of the other solutions is to have a shift in diets away from meat. So a lot of people look at their plate of food on the dinner table, and to them, a meal is, a big portion of meat with some stuff on the side. Um, we really need to kind of shift this paradigm to having meat as kind of like a treat almost, instead of like the main course of a meal, um, and looking to get protein in other sources. So it's still pretty taboo in the United States. You don't really want like a cricket on your plate, but insects, for example, are actually really good sources of nutrients and could be a viable alternative towards shifting away from things like beef production. So we'll end this first part of the food system talk with that thought, in this horrifying photo of a gigantic beetle-like creature. But thinking about, solutions or creative alternatives to help better feed a growing human population, could we better utilize insects, for example? Could we shift our diets to include more edible insects? Food for thought. I'll catch you next time.